Welcome back to Animal Quests. Every shark in these stories behaved exactly as nature intended. The people made different choices, but they all ended up with the same irreversible outcome. From a boat owner who wouldn't let go of a few $100s in tackle, even with a shark already circling his tangled catch, to a drone technician who heard the captain ban swimming and got in the water anyway for one more shot. Let's start with the first story. Two content creators who skipped the licensed guide and decided to chum the water themselves in a cloudy estuary mouth known for exactly the kind of shark neither of them had any experience with. It was the 9th of May, 2021, at the mouth of a quiet estuary along South Africa's KwaZulu-Natal coast. The morning had turned humid, and still, the kind of thick coastal air that settles right before a tide change, and the water near the estuary mouth had already gone cloudy with churned up sand and silt pushing in from the sea. Ryan Naidu, 24, worked as a commercial refrigeration technician and spent nearly every evening training for bodybuilding competitions. His closest friend, Zefran Ulrich, 21, coached strength training at a private gym and edited footage for the pair's small YouTube channel. They'd watched licensed shark tour operators take tourists out under tightly controlled conditions and decided paying for that experience made no sense when they could get better footage on their own. To me, everything starts falling apart when they convince themselves that they can do it without trained professionals. Neither of them knew much about sharks or ocean emergencies. They didn't think that would be a problem. They researched areas locally known for shark activity and settled on the estuary mouth, packing cheap snorkeling gear, an action camera on a floating hand grip, and several bags of fish scraps bought from a bait shop that morning. I think this is the toughest part to accept. They made that choice the same morning. They waded in shortly after the incoming tide started stirring up the bottom. Locals had already warned that it was the worst time to enter the water. Zefran carried the mesh bait bag and dipped it into the water every few seconds to keep sharks circling near the camera, while Ryan kept swimming ahead to get shots of sharks approaching from behind. This wasn't an animal wandering into a bad situation. It was two men actively recruiting one into their video. Bull sharks are known for tolerating brackish, low-visibility water and regularly move into estuary mouths and river systems, making them one of the few species comfortable hunting in exactly this kind of murky, mixed salinity environment. In this region, they routinely reach 7 to 11 feet and weigh several hundred pounds, hunting largely by scent and vibration when visibility drops. Within minutes, at least two shapes were visible, cutting through the cloudy water just past where either man could see clearly, moving low and steady along the bottom before angling upward toward the surface. One of them surged toward the bait bag and struck Zefran directly, the force of the hit knocking him sideways and opening wounds across his side and arm before he could react or even get his feet back under him. He went under briefly, swallowing water as the impact spun him around, then resurfaced, struggling against the current, blood already spreading in a widening cloud around him. His arm hung wrong at his side, and he was fighting just to keep his head above the surface as the current pulled at him. Instead of swimming for shore, Ryan turned back toward his friend, grabbing at him and trying to pull him through the water toward the bank, kicking hard against the current while trying to keep both their heads above the surface at once. The thrashing, the blood, and the bait bag still drifting loose in the water did exactly what it does. In nearly every similar case on record, it pulled more sharks into the immediate area instead of clearing them out. A second shark hit Ryan before he'd covered half the distance to shallow water, tearing into his leg and side with enough force that he lost the ability to stay upright in the current. The bite spun him away from Zefran entirely, and he went under, fighting to reach the surface again. He resurfaced once more, further from shore than before, arms moving weaker against the water, and then he didn't come back up. Both men disappeared beneath the surface within moments of each other. The water around them churned and darkened, and neither resurfaced again before anyone on shore realized what was happening. Their floating camera was recovered later that day, drifting near the estuary entrance. It had come loose during the struggle. Local authorities launched a marine search that stretched into the following morning, and recovery teams located both men downstream a day later. Investigators ruled the deaths a direct result of chumming for sharks in murky estuarine water without any professional oversight, compounded by staying in the water after the first strike instead of immediately swimming for shore. For me, that's the hardest part. Once Zefran went under, another person jumping in only made the situation more dangerous. The recovered footage was never made public. Authorities determined it only confirmed what the investigation had already established and chose to keep it sealed as part of the official case file rather than circulate a recording of two men's final minutes. Ryan and Zefran didn't stumble into danger. They spent the morning drawing sharks toward them. The next story moves to a reef ledge near Hawaii, where a boat owner risks his life to save a few $100s in fishing gear. It was the 18th of February, 2016, on a private fishing charter roughly 10 miles off the coast near Honolulu, Hawaii. The afternoon sun sat high and sharp over open water, the surface calm except for a light chop rolling under the boat, and a reef ledge dropped off sharply just beneath the hull where the crew had anchored for the day. Daniel Kim, 33, owned a small marine electronics repair shop and had built a reputation among friends for being practical to a fault. He hated wasting money on anything, and that included gear. That afternoon, the group had hooked a large tuna that fought hard before slipping beneath the boat, where the line tangled around a section of the reef ledge below. Fishing equipment worth several $100s was still attached, and the fish continued struggling against the snag, sending vibrations through the water that carried out into open ocean. The struggling fish and the disturbance it created had already drawn attention. Everyone on board agreed the safest move was to cut the line and let the gear go.
This is the part that gets me. No fishing gear is worth a man's life, but Daniel acted like it was.
Refusing to lose the equipment, he grabbed a dive knife, pulled on a mask, and lowered himself into the water to free the line by hand, focused entirely on the tangle beneath him. Tiger sharks are common along reef ledges like this one, drawn by vibration and blood in the water from struggling fish. Adults in this region often exceed 12 feet and can weigh close to 1,500 pounds. They're opportunistic hunters that investigate almost any disturbance nearby, and a thrashing fish tangled at the edge of a reef drop-off is exactly the kind of signal that pulls them in from a distance. Daniel worked at the tangled line for several minutes, cutting through loops of monofilament while staying close to the ledge, where visibility dropped off into deeper blue water. He didn't see the shark until it was already closing the last few feet of distance, cutting through the water low and fast along the reef line. It struck him from below and to the side, the impact driving him sideways in the water before his friends above even registered what was happening. The bite caught him across the hip and thigh, the force of it violent enough to pull him briefly under the surface. He kicked hard to get back up, one hand still gripping the dive knife, and had barely broken the surface when the shark circled back and struck a second time, this time catching his forearm and dragging him sideways again before releasing. He came back up choking, blood spreading fast around him in the water, his movements already growing weaker as he tried to twist away from where he'd last felt the shark's weight against him.
I don't think anyone on that boat expected to be pulling a friend out of the water instead of a fish.
His friends reacted immediately, one of them diving partway over the side to grab his vest while the others braced against the gunnel, hauling him up out of the water as the shark surfaced once more just beneath where he'd been floating seconds earlier. Getting him over the side took everything they had, his weight made worse by the injuries and the blood loss already working against him, and by the time they had him flat on the deck, he was barely responding to their voices. Once aboard, the crew immediately started first aid and applied pressure to the wound. They radioed for help while racing back to shore as fast as the boat could go. The injuries were severe from the first moment, and despite continuous efforts to control the bleeding during the return trip, Daniel's condition deteriorated quickly. Emergency responders met the boat at the dock and took over treatment immediately, but the damage from the attack was already too extensive. Daniel Kim was pronounced dead a short time later. Investigators concluded the attack was a direct result of entering water with an actively struggling tangled fish nearby. No footage existed, and the case was documented through crew testimony.
Standing back from it now, the tackle he wouldn't let go of ended up costing more than the boat itself.
Daniel didn't misread a shark that appeared out of nowhere. He climbed into water that was already disturbed, next to a fish that was already struggling, over gear that was never worth the risk. The next story leaves the reef ledge behind and moves to a guarded surfing beach in Cape Town, where a man convinced that officials are overreacting decides a closed beach doesn't apply to him and finds out the warning flag was raised for exactly the animal still patrolling the water. It was the 11th of March, 2017, at a popular surfing beach outside Cape Town, South Africa. The early morning air still carried a cool edge off the water, the kind that lingers until the sun climbs higher, and the surf rolled in clean and glassy, the sort of morning that usually draws a crowd before the wind picks up. Michael Orvain, 28, worked as an architectural visualization designer and had a reputation for being calm and analytical in nearly every part of his life. That same mindset made him skeptical of authority he considered excessive, and he'd said more than once that public safety officials tended to overreact rather than take real risks into account. That morning, shark spotters stationed on the cliffs above the beach tracked a large great white moving close to shore, and lifeguards responded immediately, raising the warning flag, sounding the evacuation siren, and clearing the water until the shark moved on.
What gets me is that the warning system had already done its job before Michael ever went near the water.
Rather than accepting the closure, he walked several hundred yards down the beach, well past where any lifeguard was stationed. Convinced that enough time had passed and the shark had likely already moved out of the area, he waded in alone to continue the swim he'd planned that morning. Great white sharks along this stretch of coast commonly reach 13 to 16 feet and can weigh over 2,000 pounds. They're known to patrol close to shore for extended periods, particularly near seal colonies and points where the seafloor drops off quickly, and a shark spotted once in an area often remains nearby far longer than swimmers assume, simply moving out of visual range rather than leaving entirely. Michael had been swimming parallel to the shoreline for only a few minutes, cutting through calm, chest-deep water when the surface behind him broke without warning. The strike came from below and slightly behind, the shark's full weight driving upward and catching him across the torso and shoulder, the force of it lifting him partially out of the water before pulling him back under. He surfaced briefly, disoriented and struggling against the current, and the water around him had already begun to change color. He tried to turn toward shore, kicking hard, but the shark circled back within seconds and struck again, this time catching his side and dragging him briefly beneath the surface before releasing. He came up gasping, one arm barely able to move, fighting just to keep his head above the water as the current pulled at him. Witnesses down the beach saw the disturbance and began shouting, pointing and waving toward the lifeguard tower, and lifeguards, who'd only just repositioned after the earlier warning, sprinted toward the water, grabbing a rescue board and paddling out as fast as they could manage. Michael kept trying to swim, each stroke slower than the last, blood trailing behind him in the water and drawing the shark back for a third pass that clipped his leg before it finally veered off. By the time the lifeguards reached him, Michael was barely able to hold himself above the surface, his movements weak and uncoordinated, and they worked quickly to haul him onto the board, bracing him as they turned back toward shore and paddled hard, applying pressure to the worst of the wounds the entire way in while he drifted in and out of consciousness against the board. Paramedics were already staged nearby because of the earlier shark warning that morning, and they began emergency treatment the moment Michael reached the sand.
Honestly, this might be the only story where help arrived almost instantly, and it still wasn't enough.
Despite immediate first aid, Michael Orvain was declared deceased at the scene a short time later. Investigators confirmed Michael had entered an unguarded section of beach closed minutes earlier due to a confirmed great white sighting. No footage existed, and the case was documented through witness statements. Beach management reinforced patrol coverage afterward, though staff privately noted the closure had already covered exactly what unfolded. Michael didn't ignore a warning meant for someone else. He ignored the one warning that was, in that moment, written specifically for him. The next story leaves the open coast behind and moves to a muddy tidal estuary in Florida, where a man chasing after his tangled dog decides visibility doesn't matter as much as what's thrashing underneath it. It was the 27th of July, 2019, along a tidal estuary outside Jacksonville, Florida, 3 days after a tropical storm swept through the region. The estuary had turned muddy from heavy runoff, and the incoming tide carried even more sediment through the fast-moving water, leaving visibility near zero. Eric Tholmere, 25, worked as a civil engineering survey technician and spent most weekends kayaking the estuary with his dog, an energetic retriever mix named Scout, who rode in the bow and, more than once, had jumped after birds Eric couldn't call him back from in time. While paddling through the estuary that afternoon, Scout spotted a wounded heron struggling near the bank and leapt from the kayak before Eric could grab his collar, paddling hard toward it and getting his leash tangled in a mess of submerged branches just off the channel. Local fishermen working a nearby channel called out right away, warning him that sharks regularly moved into that same brackish water after heavy storms, when runoff pushed baitfish into the channels and visibility dropped to almost nothing. They'd seen it happen after every major storm that season and clearly warned him the water wasn't safe to enter.
I don't think Eric really weighed the warning against what he was looking at. No one thinks clearly when their dog is thrashing and can't get free.
Unwilling to watch Scout drown a few feet away, he climbed out of the kayak and began wading through knee-deep water toward the tangled branches, feeling ahead of him with his hands beneath the muddy surface as he pushed forward against the current. The water was too clouded to see more than a few inches down, and every few steps he paused, reaching underwater to work at the leash line he could hear more than see. Bull sharks are among the few species built specifically for water like this, tolerating both brackish and freshwater conditions and routinely moving into flooded estuary channels and tidal creeks after heavy storms when runoff concentrates baitfish close to shore. Adults in this region commonly reach 7 to 11 feet and weigh several hundred pounds, and they rely heavily on scent and vibration to locate prey when visibility drops, which makes a person wading and splashing through knee-deep mud difficult to distinguish from something worth investigating, and a struggling, splashing dog nearby only adds to that. Eric had been working at the tangled leash for several minutes, bent forward with his arms submerged to the elbow, when the water beside him surged without warning. The shark hit low, clamping onto his lower leg with enough force to knock him sideways and pull him off balance, dragging him partially underwater before he could brace against anything. He came up shouting, thrashing against the pull, the muddy water around him churning and darkening fast as he tried to plant his feet and pull free. The current worked against him, pulling at his balance every time he tried to get solid footing, and for several seconds he was fighting the shark and the tide at the same time. It released and circled back almost immediately, striking a second time along his thigh, the force of it dragging him another few feet through the mud before letting go. He tried to crawl toward the kayak, one leg barely responding, blood spreading fast through the already muddy water around him, Scout still tangled and barking a few feet away. Nearby kayakers who'd heard the commotion paddled toward him immediately, shouting for him to keep moving as they closed the distance, reaching him within seconds and grabbing at his arms and vest to haul him back toward one of the kayaks while he struggled to help pull his own weight through the water. What stays with me here is how fast this turned.
One moment he was trying to save his dog, but the next, he couldn't see what had gotten hold of him.
The kayakers worked together to get Eric onto a kayak, bracing him across the hull while paddling hard back toward the launch point and applying pressure to the injury along the way. Emergency responders met them at the boat ramp, but the damage had already proven overwhelming. Eric Tholmir was pronounced dead a short time later. Scout was freed by one of the fishermen shortly after and was unharmed. Investigators concluded he'd entered known post-storm shark habitat on foot against warnings from fishermen minutes earlier. No footage existed, and the case was documented through witness accounts. Local guides reinforced their warnings afterward, though several noted the danger had already been common knowledge among anyone who fished those channels. Eric wasn't guessing what was in the water. Local fishermen told him, and he went in anyway. The next story moves far offshore, where a stranded ship's engineer defies a direct order to recover drifting equipment. It was the 5th of May, 2015, aboard a commercial vessel drifting in a remote section of the Philippine Sea, hundreds of miles from the nearest land and well beyond any normal shipping route. The afternoon sky stretched flat and empty in every direction. The ocean beneath it, a deep, featureless blue that dropped thousands of feet straight down, and the ship sat without propulsion, after an engine failure had left it drifting for several hours. Mark Santos, 30, worked as an offshore communications engineer, spending months at a time aboard vessels servicing equipment across remote stretches of open ocean. He'd built a career on being the person who fixed things others couldn't, and colleagues described him as someone who took equipment failures personally, as though every broken piece of gear was a problem he was somehow responsible for solving immediately.
That mindset works on land, but out here, it becomes a habit of putting gear before safety.
As the crew worked to restore propulsion that afternoon, an expensive hardshell diagnostic case slid across the deck during a routine equipment move and went over the side, landing in water that ran thousands of feet deep beneath the hull. The airtight case kept it floating as the current slowly carried it away from the ship. The captain reacted immediately, ordering everyone to leave the case behind and focus entirely on restoring propulsion to the vessel. Drifting powerless in open water, far from any shipping lane, was already a serious enough situation without anyone in the water. Mark knew how much the equipment cost and how difficult it would be to replace out here, and that knowledge outweighed everything else in the moment. Ignoring the captain's order, he climbed down a rope ladder along the side of the hull and lowered himself into the water, swimming out from the boat toward the drifting case, focused entirely on catching up to it before the current carried it further away. Oceanic white-tip sharks are known to patrol far offshore in deep open water, and they often investigate drifting objects because floating debris can attract fish and other potential food sources nearby. Adults commonly reach 8 to 10 feet and can weigh several hundred pounds, and they are considered one of the more dangerous species in open ocean, specifically because they show little hesitation approaching anything unfamiliar floating at the surface, including a swimmer far from any boat. Mark had covered a good distance from the vessel, reaching for the case with the current still pulling it just out of his grasp, when a shape broke the surface behind him without warning. Crew members on deck spotted it only seconds before the shark closed the distance, and by the time anyone could shout a warning, it had already reached him. It bit into his side with enough force to spin him around in the water before releasing and immediately circling back, closing in again as he struggled to turn toward the vessel. He fought to stay afloat, kicking hard against the pull of the current, and the shark struck a second time, catching his arm as he tried to shield himself and dragging him briefly under before letting go. He surfaced gasping, barely able to keep himself above the water, one arm no longer answering, blood spreading fast around him with nothing nearby to slow it down. He fought to stay afloat, the open water around him offering no shallow end, no reef, nothing to retreat toward. Crew members scrambled to lower a rescue line, shouting instructions down to him as he tried to close the distance to the hull, watching the shark surface once more just behind him before veering off. Mark grabbed at the line twice before finally getting a grip on it, his strength already failing, and after a frantic effort lasting several minutes, the crew managed to haul him up the side of the ship, his body scraping against the hull the entire way up.
This is the part that's hard to shake. Out there, there's no shoreline to reach, no shallow water to stand in. Just open ocean in every direction.
Once aboard, the crew laid Mark out on deck and began emergency first aid, but the injuries proved too severe. Mark Santos died aboard the vessel a short time later before the crew could restore power or reach port. The captain confirmed Mark had disregarded a direct order to stay aboard. No footage existed, and the case was documented through crew testimony. The shipping company reinforced protocols afterward, though crew members noted the danger had never needed clarifying. Mark didn't misjudge a shark that surprised him close to shore. He swam voluntarily into open water thousands of feet deep, chasing equipment the captain had already told him to let go. The next story moves to a quiet beach in Queensland, Australia, where an endurance athlete follows the same swimming routine he'd trusted for years until one morning, the ocean decides to change the rules. It was the 12th of October, 2022, at a quiet stretch of coastline in Queensland, Australia. The early morning air was still cool, the ocean calm under overcast skies, and small groups of seabirds had begun gathering and diving just offshore, circling low over patches of water where baitfish churned near the surface. Jake Iskavar, 27, worked as a physical education instructor and trained as an amateur endurance athlete, following a strict open water swimming schedule as he prepared for an upcoming endurance race. Friends described him as disciplined almost to a fault, someone who treated his training plan as something close to sacred and rarely allowed anything to interrupt it.
To me, that discipline worked against him. The same habit that makes someone dependable can also make them stop noticing when today isn't like yesterday.
That morning, the beach remained open, and only a handful of swimmers, surfers, and anglers had arrived before sunrise. Several fishermen noticed unusually large schools of baitfish packed close to shore, while flocks of terns repeatedly dove into the same patch of water. One of them even remarked that something larger had to be pushing the bait toward the beach, but without a confirmed shark sighting, there was no reason for lifeguards to close the area. Jake arrived shortly after sunrise, stretched on the sand, and entered the water at the same spot where he'd started dozens of previous training sessions.
I think that's what makes this story so unsettling. Nobody told him not to swim that morning.
The danger wasn't an ignored warning sign, it was assuming the ocean would behave exactly the way it had every other day. Tiger sharks are known to follow schools of baitfish into shallow coastal waters, particularly when seabirds are actively diving on the same school, since both are reliable indicators of a feeding event already underway. Adults in Australian coastal waters commonly reach 11 to 14 feet and can weigh over 1,000 pounds, and a tiger shark already feeding beneath a bait ball may investigate any swimmer passing directly through the disturbance. Jake had completed nearly half of his planned route when he noticed the birds diving farther offshore. Thinking the calmer water beyond the baitfish would make for an easier swim, he angled slightly toward them and settled back into his steady rhythm. Seconds later, the water beneath him erupted. A tiger shark surged upward from below, clamping onto his side and driving him sideways before releasing almost immediately. The force knocked the air from his lungs and sent him underwater in a cloud of bubbles. When he surfaced, he spun around trying to understand what had happened, but all he could see was blood spreading across the surface. What sticks with me is how quickly an ordinary morning disappeared.
One moment he was counting training strokes, and the next, he was fighting just to stay above the water.
He immediately turned for shore, pulling himself forward with uneven strokes as pain and blood loss began slowing him down. Before he'd covered much distance, the shark circled back and struck a second time, clamping onto his lower leg and spinning him sideways again before releasing. Nearby surfers heard the shouting and paddled toward him at full speed, reaching him within moments and helping pull him across a surfboard, while another surfer raced toward shore to alert lifeguards. Lifeguards launched a rescue board immediately and reached the group within minutes. they transferred Jake onto the board and paddled hard back toward the beach while applying pressure to his wounds. Once on the sand, off-duty paramedics who happened to be nearby began emergency treatment immediately, but the injuries sustained during the two attacks had already proven catastrophic. Jake Escobar was pronounced dead at the scene a short time later, despite the rapid response from both the surfers, lifeguards, and paramedics. Investigators who reviewed the incident with Queensland Marine authorities concluded that there had been no official beach closure because no shark had been sighted before the attack. However, witness statements from local fishermen and surfers confirmed that unusually dense baitfish schools and concentrated seabird activity had been visible in the area shortly beforehand, conditions consistent with active predator feeding. Beach safety officials later reminded the public that natural signs in the water can sometimes provide the earliest warning of shark activity even before a shark is actually seen. Jake didn't ignore a warning flag. He ignored the ocean itself. The next story moves nearly 40 miles offshore to a fishing charter near Perth, where a drone technician decides a captain's warning doesn't apply to him. It was the 9th of August, 2018, nearly 40 miles off the coast of Exmouth in northern Western Australia, aboard a multi-day tuna fishing charter. The afternoon sun sat low over open water, the deck still damp from hosing down after the day's catch, and traces of blood and fish oil lingered in the water around the hull despite the crew's efforts to clean up after landing several large tuna that morning. Liam Parker, 24, worked as a commercial drone technician and spent nearly every weekend chasing unusual footage for a growing set of social media pages. Friends admired his creativity, but often joked that he always wanted to get closer than everyone else, treating distance as something other people needed, and he didn't.
Honestly, that reputation alone should have been a warning sign to the people around him long before this trip.
As the afternoon wore on, several oceanic white-tip sharks began circling the vessel, drawn in by the scent still lingering in the water from the day's fishing. Recognizing the risk, the captain suspended all swimming immediately and repeatedly warned the group to stay aboard until the sharks moved off. Believing the sharks were simply curious and posed little real threat, Liam quietly climbed over the side of the boat, carrying only an action camera, ignoring the captain's warning entirely. For me, this is what sets him apart from everyone else in this series. He saw the sharks arrive, heard the warning, and went into the water anyway. Instead of staying near the boarding ladder where the crew could reach him quickly if needed, he deliberately swam several yards away from the hull to get a clearer angle, repeatedly diving beneath the surface to film the sharks moving around him. Crew members immediately shouted for him to return to the ladder as soon as he entered the water, but he waved them off and kept swimming outward. Oceanic white-tip sharks are known for their persistence around vessels with fishing activity, often remaining nearby as long as food stimuli remain in the water. Adults commonly reach 8 to 10 feet and weigh several hundred pounds, and unlike many species that hesitate around unfamiliar objects, they often approach steadily and directly, showing little caution once they've identified something in the water as worth investigating. Liam had been in the water for several minutes, diving down repeatedly to get shots of the sharks passing beneath him. He didn't notice that one of the sharks had stopped circling the group and turned to track him directly, closing the distance low and fast along the surface. It struck him from the side without warning, the impact knocking him sideways in the water and pulling him briefly under before he surfaced again, struggling and disoriented, his camera still gripped in one hand. Crew members on deck, who had already been shouting for him to come back since he first entered the water, scrambled for the rescue line the moment they saw the strike, but the shark circled back within seconds and struck a second time before anyone could reach him, catching his leg and dragging him briefly beneath the surface again. He fought his way back up, gasping, one arm barely responding, kicking hard to try to close the distance to the hull, but the current and his own injuries worked against him. The water around him had already begun to change color.
What gets me is that the captain warned him exactly what would happen before Liam even entered the water. There was no misunderstanding, he simply chose to ignore it.
The shark surfaced a third time, closing in again before veering off at the last moment, brushing against his leg as it passed. Liam twisted away instinctively, swallowing water, his movements growing slower with every second. The crew threw the recovery line as close to him as they could manage, and Liam reached for it twice before his fingers finally caught the rope, his strength already failing as he tried to pull himself toward the hull while the shark continued circling somewhere just beneath the surface. Crew members hauled him back onto the vessel within minutes, pulling him over the side and laying him out on deck to begin emergency first aid, applying pressure to the wounds while radioing for help. Despite continuous efforts, the injuries from the 3 strikes were immediately recognized as severe. Liam Parker died on the deck of the fishing boat before the vessel could reach port. Investigators determined Liam had entered the water directly against the captain's explicit warning, with multiple sharks already circling the vessel. Footage existed but was withheld out of respect for the family. The charter operator reinforced safety protocols afterward, though the rule had already been made clear to him minutes before he went over the side. Liam didn't misjudge a shark he never saw coming. He watched several of them circle the boat, heard the warning meant specifically for that situation, and got in the water anyway to get a shot no one else was willing to risk.